A new chapter for the Bennetts. The Bennetts had always dreamed of owning a home in a neighborhood like Oakwood Hills, a place known for its tidy lawns, elegant homes, and safe streets. They saw it as the perfect environment to raise their two young children, Emily and Jordan. After years of hard work and saving, Malcolm Bennett, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, and his wife, Sharon, finally made their dream come true. They had moved in only a week prior, and today they were excited to celebrate with a backyard barbecue, hoping it would be a chance to make friends with their new neighbors. Malcolm stood confidently over the grill, a wide smile on his face as he flipped burgers and marinated ribs. His pride in this home, in this life they had built, was unmistakable. Sharon, warm and cheerful, moved between the kitchen and the backyard, carrying trays of lemonade and snacks for the kids. She glanced around at the setup and gave Malcolm an approving smile. "It's all coming together, babe," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction as she watched their children chase each other across the yard. Emily, 10, and Jordan, 8, were squealing with laughter, spraying each other with water pistols under the bright summer sun. To the Bennetts, this was everything they had ever dreamed of: family, laughter, and the sense of belonging. Just a few houses down, however, Margaret Turner was not sharing in the joy. A resident of Oakwood Hills for over 30 years, Margaret was known for her pristine garden and her even more precise views on keeping up appearances. She watched the Bennetts gathering from her front window, her face twisted into a frown. From the moment she had seen their moving truck pull in, Margaret had felt something was off. The Bennetts didn't quite fit her image of Oakwood Hills residents. As more of the Bennetts' friends and family arrived, Margaret's expression grew tighter. The sound of music and the sight of children playing in the backyard seemed to grate on her nerves. To her, it was as if the Bennetts had turned their backyard into a carnival, disturbing the peace she cherished. She counted every car parked along the curb, each one seeming to confirm her worst fears about the family that had moved in. "These people are bringing noise and trouble," she muttered to herself, crossing her arms over her chest. She shook her head and pursed her lips, thinking of all the rules and standards that had kept Oakwood Hills a respectable place for decades. Determined to put a stop to what she perceived as an invasion of her quiet suburban paradise, Margaret stormed into her kitchen and picked up her phone. "Hello. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance," she said tersely to the dispatcher. "There's a very large, very loud gathering in my neighborhood. It looks like things could get out of hand. Someone needs to come out here and handle this before it becomes a problem." The dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent shortly, and Margaret hung up with a sense of satisfaction. She returned to her window, watching the scene unfold in the Bennetts' yard with a smug smile, confident that the police would restore order. Back in the Bennetts' yard, the atmosphere was filled with laughter and easy conversation. Malcolm was recounting a funny story from his job at the fire department, making his guests laugh. For him, today's barbecue was more than just a party. It was a celebration of their new life, of everything they had worked for. He looked over at his wife and felt a swell of pride. They had built this life together through hard work and sacrifice, and now finally, they had a place to call their own. The afternoon was warm, the smell of grilling food filled the air, and the chatter of friends and family created a comforting background hum. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the peaceful atmosphere took an unexpected turn. The sound of approaching sirens brought an uncomfortable hush over the crowd. A police car slowly pulled up to the curb outside the Bennetts' house, and an officer stepped out, looking around with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Malcolm noticed the shift immediately. His training as a firefighter had taught him to remain calm in tense situations, but the sight of a police car at his family gathering was unsettling. He set down his spatula, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked towards the front of the yard to meet the officer, his smile polite but guarded. As he approached, the officer gave a small nod. "Afternoon, sir. I'm Officer Randall. We got a call about a disturbance," the officer said, his tone neutral. Malcolm nodded. "We're just having a family barbecue, officer. It's our first weekend here, and we're celebrating with friends. Nothing's out of hand." Officer Randall looked over the yard, his eyes taking in the children playing, the guests sitting and chatting peacefully. There was no sign of chaos, no raised voices or rowdy behavior, just the ordinary sounds of a family gathering. Before Officer Randall could respond, Margaret Turner appeared at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed tightly and a look of disdain on her face. She marched up, her voice cutting through the evening air. "That's them. That's the family causing all the noise," she snapped, pointing towards the Bennett's backyard, as if she were identifying a group of criminals. "This is a quiet neighborhood, and we don't need this kind of behavior disturbing our peace." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes meeting the officer's. This was not the first time he had encountered someone like Margaret Turner, and he knew better than to let anger dictate his response. Instead, he waited, his gaze steady, as Officer Randall shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between his duty and the awkwardness of the situation. "Ma'am," Officer Randall began, glancing between Margaret and Malcolm, "I don't see anything here that's causing a disturbance. Everything seems calm. And this looks like a regular family gathering." Margaret huffed, her face reddening with frustration. "Calm. This kind of noise may be acceptable in other neighborhoods, but this is Oakwood Hills. We don't need children running wild and loud music upsetting the peace." Officer Randall glanced at Malcolm, who had kept his composure throughout Margaret's outburst. Malcolm finally spoke, his tone respectful but firm. "Officer, we've done nothing but celebrate in our own backyard with our family and friends. We're not causing any harm, and the music isn't loud enough to disturb anyone beyond a couple of houses. We're not strangers to community standards." His voice was calm but carried a weight that wasn't lost on the officer or the guests who were watching. It was a reminder that he, too, was a member of the community, and he had a right to enjoy his home just like anyone else. Seeing the situation for what it was, Officer Randall nodded, addressing Malcolm directly. "Sir, it does appear everything is in order here. I'll note that the complaint was addressed, and it doesn't seem like any further action is needed." The guests in the backyard visibly relaxed, sensing that the situation was being resolved. But Margaret wasn't finished. "You're just going to let this continue?" she demanded, her voice filled with incredulity. "This is a respectable neighborhood. We don't need parties like this. People like them." She paused, casting a deliberate look at Malcolm and his family. At that, Malcolm stepped forward, his voice steady, but filled with an unmistakable strength. "Ma'am, we are your neighbors now, whether you like it or not. We're here to raise our family, to work, to contribute to this community, just like anyone else. We're not going anywhere." The look in his eyes left no room for doubt. He wasn't merely defending his right to host a barbecue. He was asserting his family's place in this community. For a moment, Margaret seemed at a loss, thrown off by Malcolm's confidence and composure. She muttered something under her breath before turning on her heel and marching back to her house, retreating behind her closed doors. As Officer Randall nodded respectfully and headed back to his car, Malcolm turned back towards his family, a deep resolve in his heart. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be more battles to face in their new home. But as he looked at Sharon, who was beaming with pride, and his children, who had resumed playing, he felt a powerful determination rise within him. The Bennetts were here to stay, and no amount of prejudice or hostility would change that. The silent storm. A week had passed since the confrontation at the barbecue, but the echo of Margaret Turner's glare and disdainful words still lingered in Malcolm Bennett's mind. Although the police officer had assured him that they were free to continue their gathering, the incident had left an unshakable feeling that Oakwood Hills wasn't quite the sanctuary they'd hoped for. Malcolm had grown up knowing what it felt like to be an outsider, and he'd hoped that he and his family had finally found a place where they could belong without fear of prejudice or judgment. But now, a part of him worried about the impact this new tension would have on his children. Sharon had tried to put the incident behind them, dismissing Margaret Turner as just a bitter old woman with too much time on her hands. But she noticed the way Malcolm's shoulders tensed when he glanced out their front window, the way he lingered before heading out to work, as if steeling himself against the possibility of further conflict. She herself had felt the sting of judgment in the neighborhood. Subtle things like neighbors averting their eyes or conversations falling silent when she walked by. It was as if Margaret's whispers had spread through Oakwood Hills, sowing seeds of suspicion that took root in the minds of the neighbors. Sharon had initially brushed it off as paranoia, but then little things began to happen. One morning, while picking up groceries, she noticed a few other shoppers looking at her, their gazes lingering a little too long. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the shopping list in her hand. But when she reached the checkout, she couldn't help but overhear a whispered conversation between two women behind her. "Did you hear about the new family on Maple Drive?" one woman said, her voice just loud enough for Sharon to catch. "They threw a huge party last weekend. The police were called, and everything." Sharon clenched her jaw, feeling a prickle of anger. It wasn't just Margaret anymore. The rumors had clearly spread beyond her immediate circle. Now, people were talking about the Bennetts as if they were a public nuisance. Sharon kept her head high, paid for her groceries, and walked out with her shoulders squared, refusing to let them see how much their words stung. But on the drive home, her mind was racing. Would the entire community treat them this way? Meanwhile, Malcolm tried to stay focused on his work at the fire department, where he had earned the respect of his team through years of hard work and dedication. But that same respect didn't extend to his neighborhood, where he felt as if he was constantly under surveillance. Every time he walked outside, it felt like eyes were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. One evening, he came home to find Sharon on the porch, watching their kids play in the yard. She looked thoughtful, her gaze distant. When he asked her what was on her mind, she hesitated before telling him about the whispers she'd overheard at the grocery store. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. He had faced worse than whispers before, but this was different. This was his home, the place where his children were supposed to feel safe. "We can't let this get to us," he said, though his voice was strained. "We've dealt with people like this before. We just have to keep doing what we're doing." Sharon nodded, though her eyes held a flicker of doubt. "I know, but I worry about the kids. They're still young. They don't understand why people might treat us differently. I just don't want them to feel like they don't belong here." As the days passed, it seemed that Margaret Turner was determined to make the Bennetts feel like outsiders. She was often seen talking to other neighbors, her voice hushed but intense, her expressions exaggerated as if recounting some great offense. Whenever Malcolm or Sharon walked by, she would fall silent, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. It was clear that she was doing her best to turn the neighborhood against them. The Bennetts' trash cans were suddenly knocked over more frequently, even on calm nights when the wind couldn't be blamed. Once they found a pamphlet stuck in their door, a welcome brochure from the Oakwood Hills Neighborhood Association, outlining community standards and expectations around property maintenance, noise levels, and behavior. The timing of its arrival was too pointed to be a coincidence. Despite the quiet hostility, the Bennetts refused to back down. Malcolm and Sharon decided that they would double down on their involvement in the community, not retreat. They attended local events, signed their kids up for the neighborhood soccer league, and even volunteered for the Oakwood Hills Summer Fest, hoping to show their neighbors that they were committed to being a part of the community. But Margaret's influence ran deep. Every time they volunteered, every time they showed up to support a local cause, they were met with forced smiles and polite but cold receptions. It was as if everyone was waiting for them to prove Margaret right, to show that they were indeed troublemakers. Then one evening, as Malcolm was finishing up paperwork at the fire station, his phone buzzed with a text from Sharon. "You won't believe what just happened." Mrs. Turner was at it again, talking to people at the park, telling them we're dangerous. Malcolm's pulse quickened as he read the message. He wrapped up his work and headed home, a mix of frustration and exhaustion weighing on him. When he arrived, he found Sharon on the porch, watching Emily and Jordan play in the yard. She looked up as he walked over, and he could see the weariness in her eyes. "What did she say this time?" Malcolm asked, his voice tinged with exasperation. "She was telling some of the other parents that we're a disruptive influence, that we don't fit in here," Sharon said quietly. "She even suggested that we might be a safety concern for the neighborhood." Malcolm's jaw clenched, his frustration bubbling over. "Unbelievable. She's trying to turn everyone against us, to make us look like criminals in our own home." Sharon sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of it all. "I don't know what to do, Malcolm. If we confront her, it'll just look like we're causing more trouble. But if we do nothing, she'll keep spreading these lies." Malcolm stared out at the street, where Margaret's house loomed in the distance, casting a shadow over their peace. He knew that direct confrontation would only play into her hands. Margaret was the kind of person who thrived on conflict, who would use any reaction to paint them in a negative light. But there was one thing she didn't know. Malcolm wasn't just a new neighbor. He was a respected firefighter, a man who had risked his life for this community, and he wasn't going to let her tear down everything he'd built. "We're not going to let her push us out," he said finally, his voice steady. "We've worked too hard to let someone like her make us feel like we don't belong here." Sharon nodded, though she still looked troubled. "I just wish there was a way to show everyone who we really are, to let them see past her lies." Malcolm reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll find a way," he promised. "We'll keep living our lives, keep doing what we've always done. And when the time is right, we'll show them the truth." As the days turned into weeks, the tension with Margaret only seemed to grow. She continued to spread rumors, to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the neighbors. Malcolm noticed that small gatherings would form near her house, conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he or Sharon walked by. It was a quiet war of whispers and glances, a battle fought in the shadows. Despite everything, the Bennetts refused to be pushed out. They threw themselves into the community, attending town meetings, volunteering at events, and reaching out to neighbors who seemed open to friendship. They were determined to prove Margaret wrong, to show that they were not the disruptive influence she claimed they were. Slowly, they began to build a small circle of allies, neighbors who saw through Margaret's lies and welcomed the Bennetts with open arms. It was a small victory, but it gave them hope that they could eventually overcome the prejudice and hostility that had greeted them. Yet, as they worked to build their new life, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't done with them. She had been too determined, too relentless in her campaign against them. He sensed that she was waiting, watching, looking for any opportunity to escalate her efforts. And he was right. The real storm was still on the horizon, and it would test the Bennetts in ways they had never imagined. A brewing storm. The following weeks were filled with a mix of resilience and dread for the Bennetts. Though they held their heads high and continued building connections with the more welcoming neighbors, they couldn't ignore the simmering tension that seemed to cling to Oakwood Hills. The whispers, the cold glances, and Margaret's relentless attempts to paint them as a threat. It was exhausting, but they refused to let it push them out. Malcolm and Sharon knew they had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let someone like Margaret Turner make them feel unwelcome in their own home. Despite their determination, Margaret's efforts seemed to be working on some of the residents. Malcolm began noticing subtle changes. The friendly waves he'd received from neighbors on his morning jogs had become rare, replaced by wary glances. Sharon, once warmly greeted at the grocery store and local park, now found herself on the receiving end of sidelong looks, as if people were expecting her to act out at any moment. One Sunday morning, as Malcolm and Sharon were preparing breakfast, there was a loud knock on the front door. They exchanged a look, a sense of unease settling in the pit of their stomachs. Malcolm wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and opened the door, only to find a man and a woman standing on his porch, both with stern expressions. "Good morning," the man said, His voice clipped. He introduced himself as Charles Hampton, the president of the Oakwood Hills Neighborhood Association, and gestured to the woman beside him, who he introduced as Mary Lang, the association's secretary. "Can we come in? We'd like to discuss a few things," Charles continued, though his tone suggested that it wasn't really a question. Sharon appeared in the doorway, her expression guarded, but she nodded, and they led their visitors into the living room. As they settled in, Charles cleared his throat and looked at Malcolm and Sharon with a serious expression. "We've received several complaints from residents about disruptions," he began, choosing his words carefully. "There are concerns that your recent activities, the gathering, for example, don't align with the quiet nature of Oakwood Hills. We'd like to remind you that this is a peaceful neighborhood with certain standards and expectations." Sharon's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Hampton, we held one gathering, and it was a quiet family event. I don't see how that's against the standards of the neighborhood." Mary Lang shifted uncomfortably, as if she wished she weren't there. "It's not just the gathering," she said softly. "There have been concerns raised about potential safety risks, about whether certain people might not feel comfortable with the new dynamic in the neighborhood." Malcolm narrowed his eyes, his patience wearing thin. "Are you suggesting that our presence here makes people uncomfortable?" Charles held up his hands, a forced smile on his face. "We're simply here to ensure that Oakwood Hills remains a peaceful, family-oriented community. Perhaps you could make an effort to keep things low-key, to avoid any events that might draw too much attention or cause undue concern among your neighbors." The coded language was as clear as it was infuriating. They weren't outright saying the Bennetts were a problem, but the implication was unmistakable. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "We came here to raise our family in peace, just like anyone else in this neighborhood. We're not here to cause trouble, but we won't apologize for living our lives or for making this our home." Charles and Mary exchanged a glance, clearly taken aback by his response. They had likely expected Malcolm to back down, to appease them with promises to tone things down. Instead, they were faced with a man who was determined to stand his ground. After an uncomfortable silence, Charles cleared his throat again. "Well, we'll leave it at that then. But do keep in mind that we'll be watching for any future issues." As they left, Malcolm closed the door and took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. Sharon placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "They're just trying to scare us, Malcolm. We can't let them win." He nodded, though the encounter had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew that this wasn't the end of it, that Margaret, with her influence in the neighborhood, would continue her campaign. And he was right. In the days that followed, the Bennetts began experiencing a string of small, targeted incidents. It started with harmless annoyances. Their garbage cans were knocked over almost every morning, their mailbox mysteriously jammed with flyers for various services they hadn't requested, and their garden hose mysteriously cut one evening. But then things escalated. Malcolm came home one day to find that someone had smeared mud across their front door. The children's bikes, left in the driveway, were moved into the street, as if to invite trouble. Even more troubling, they found a note stuck to their car window one morning, with the words "Go back to where you came from" scrawled in jagged letters. Sharon was shaken by the note, her mind racing with worry. She feared for her children, for their safety in a place that was supposed to be a refuge. Malcolm was furious, but he knew that confronting their unknown tormentors directly could backfire, giving people like Margaret more ammunition to turn the neighborhood against them. "I'll talk to the precinct," he told Sharon that evening, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I'll see if they can increase patrols in the area. Keep an eye out. We're not going to let anyone scare us out of our own home." But as the Bennetts learned, Margaret wasn't just using direct intimidation. She was spreading insidious rumors that cast a shadow over their every move. Sharon overheard snide comments from other parents at school functions, murmurs that her children were too rough or too unruly for Oakwood Hills. Malcolm noticed that when he went for his morning jogs, neighbors he had once greeted warmly now looked away, as if avoiding him. One evening, as he was putting Emily and Jordan to bed, Jordan looked up at him with worried eyes. "Daddy, why don't the other kids want to play with us at school?" he asked, his small voice filled with confusion. "They used to, but now they say we're different." Malcolm's heart ached as he looked down at his son, realizing that the prejudice and judgment aimed at them was now hurting his children. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are new or different, buddy, but that doesn't mean we're any less than anyone else. We just have to show them who we are and be kind, no matter what." Jordan nodded, though the worry in his eyes didn't fully fade. Malcolm kissed his forehead, silently promising that he would protect his family, no matter what it took. But the worst incident was yet to come. One Sunday, as they returned from a family outing, they found their house had been egged. The eggs dripped down their front windows, splattering the porch and leaving a rancid smell. The sight made Sharon gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Malcolm's face hardened as he surveyed the damage. He looked at his wife, who was holding back tears, and his children, who looked scared and confused. This was more than just a prank. It was a message. He stepped forward and took Sharon's hand. "We're going to report this, and we're going to stand strong. No one is going to force us out of our home." That night, Malcolm filed a formal report with the police, detailing all the incidents that had been piling up. He spoke to his fellow officers, and a few of them agreed to increase their presence in the area, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. As they drifted off to sleep, Sharon lay awake, the day's events swirling in her mind. She was afraid, but she also felt a spark of anger and defiance. They had endured too much, sacrificed too much, to let one bigoted neighbor push them out of Oakwood Hills. This was their home, and they would fight for it, together. Little did they know, however, that Margaret had one more plan in store. She was not going to let the Bennetts settle in quietly, and her next move would test their resolve in a way they had never expected. The breaking point. The Bennetts had come to expect the subtle acts of hostility, the veiled glares, and the whispers from neighbors. But nothing could have prepared them for the shocking sight they found one brisk Monday morning. Malcolm was the first to see it as he stepped outside to pick up the morning newspaper. Spray painted across their garage door, in bright red letters, were the words, "You don't belong here." He froze, his fists clenching as he took in the hateful message, the aggressive red paint a stark contrast against the clean, white surface of their garage. Sharon, who had followed him outside with a cup of coffee in hand, gasped when she saw it. She put a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with shock and a deep-seated hurt. The sound of their children's footsteps approaching from the house broke the silence. "Mommy, Daddy, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice full of concern as she caught sight of her parents' expressions. Malcolm quickly stepped in front of the words, trying to shield his kids from the ugly message, but he was too late. Both Emily and Jordan had already seen it. Jordan's eyes welled up with tears. "Daddy, why would someone say that?" he whispered, looking up at Malcolm with a mixture of confusion and fear. Malcolm took a deep breath, struggling to keep his composure. He knelt down and put his hands on his children's shoulders, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes people say things they don't understand. They think it's okay to hurt others, even when it's wrong. But you know what? We are strong, and we are a family. Nothing anyone says can take that away from us." Sharon crouched down beside him, wrapping her arms around both kids. "We belong here just as much as anyone else," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "And we're going to keep proving that, no matter what." Malcolm gave Sharon's hand a reassuring squeeze and stood up, pulling out his phone to take a picture of the graffiti. He dialed the precinct, reporting the incident with a steady but hardened voice. The police promised to send someone over to document it, and Malcolm felt a small sense of relief, though the ache in his chest remained. This was a line crossed. This wasn't just whispers and side glances. This was an outright attack on their home and their place in the community. As they waited for the police to arrive, Malcolm grabbed a bucket of soapy water and a sponge. He began scrubbing the hateful words from their garage, his jaw set in determination. Sharon joined him, and together they worked in silence, united by an unspoken resolve. They would not let this act of hatred define them. A police car pulled up shortly after, and 2 officers stepped out. One of them was Officer Randall, the same young man who had responded to the noise complaint during their first barbecue. He greeted Malcolm with a respectful nod, his expression sympathetic. "Captain Bennett, I'm sorry you have to deal with this," Officer Randall said quietly. "We'll take some photos and file a report, but if you have any idea who might be responsible, we'd be glad to investigate further." Malcolm sighed, shaking his head. "I don't have proof, but I have a pretty strong suspicion. Margaret Turner has been spreading rumors about us since we moved in, trying to turn the neighborhood against us. I wouldn't put it past her to be behind this." Officer Randall exchanged a look with his partner, then nodded. "I'll see if we can keep an eye on her house and ask around the neighborhood. This kind of behavior has no place here." As the officers documented the scene, neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, whispering and pointing at the Bennett's garage. Malcolm noticed the familiar faces of those who had been friendly with them, along with the more hostile neighbors who had avoided them in recent weeks. He felt a mixture of shame and anger, knowing that Margaret's rumors had painted them in a false light and emboldened this kind of harassment. One of the more supportive neighbors, a woman named Linda, stepped forward. She looked at Malcolm with kind, sympathetic eyes. "Malcolm, Sharon, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said softly. "Not everyone here agrees with people like Margaret. I just want you to know that there are folks here who support you." Sharon managed a small smile. "Thank you, Linda. It means a lot to know we're not completely alone." The small act of kindness lifted their spirits, if only slightly. As Linda walked away, Malcolm and Sharon returned inside with their children, seeking the comfort of their home. But even there, they couldn't escape the heavy feeling of being unwelcome, of knowing that someone had gone out of their way to send them a message of hate. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a determined silence hung over the family. Emily and Jordan picked at their food, still visibly shaken by the morning's events. Malcolm and Sharon exchanged a look, both silently agreeing that they couldn't let this incident break them. "I think we need to do something," Malcolm said, breaking the silence. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about standing up to people like Margaret, to anyone who thinks they can intimidate us." Sharon nodded, her expression resolute. "You're right. Maybe it's time we confront this head-on. We can't keep pretending everything is fine, hoping it will go away on its own." They decided to call a community meeting, inviting neighbors to discuss recent events and confront the hostility that had crept into Oakwood Hills. They printed flyers, going door to door and handing them out to everyone, including Margaret. They wanted to make it clear that they weren't backing down. The day of the meeting arrived, and as the Bennetts entered the community center, they saw that a surprisingly large number of neighbors had shown up. There was a tension in the air, a sense that this gathering was long overdue. Malcolm took a deep breath, steeling himself as he walked to the front of the room, Sharon by his side. "Thank you all for coming," Malcolm began, his voice strong and steady. "I know that since my family moved here, there have been issues. We've heard the rumors, we've seen the glances, and we've experienced the hostility. But today, I want to make something clear. We are here to stay. We moved to Oakwood Hills to build a life, to be part of this community, and we're not going to let a few people make us feel like we don't belong." A murmur went through the crowd, and Malcolm saw Margaret standing at the back of the room, her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. He directed his next words to her. "Someone vandalized our home," he said, his voice tightening with anger. "They spray-painted hateful words across our garage, trying to send us a message. but the only message they sent was that they're afraid. Afraid of seeing their world change, afraid of people who are different from them. Well, we're not afraid, and we're not going anywhere. Sharon stepped forward, her voice filled with emotion. We came here because we believed Oakwood Hills was a community where we could raise our children in peace, and I still believe that. I believe there are good people here, people who value kindness and respect. But we all need to stand up against hate. We can't let it fester in our community. Linda, the supportive neighbor, raised her hand and spoke up. I agree with the Bennetts. This community should be a place where everyone feels safe and welcome, regardless of their background. I'm embarrassed that this kind of behavior has been happening right under our noses. The room fell silent, and Malcolm noticed several people nodding in agreement. Margaret's smug expression faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line as she looked away, realizing that she was losing support. Another neighbor, a man named George, who had initially seemed distant and reserved, stood up. I'll admit, I was wary when you first moved in, he said, his voice hesitant but genuine. But I see now that it was wrong of me to judge you based on someone else's words. I'm sorry, and I'm willing to make things right. One by one, neighbors began to express their support for the Bennetts, sharing their embarrassment over the treatment they had endured. Margaret, realizing she was in the minority, quietly slipped out of the room, defeated. As the meeting wrapped up, Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him. He knew there would still be challenges, that not everyone would change overnight. But he also knew that he had found allies, people who would stand with them against the prejudice that had once threatened to push them out. That night, as the Bennetts returned home, Malcolm felt lighter, the weight of months of tension beginning to lift. They had faced down the storm, and though it hadn't fully passed, they had proven their strength, their right to belong. The Bennetts weren't just residents of Oakwood Hills, they were a part of it, and nothing would ever change that. Shadows in the night. The Bennetts had hoped the community meeting would bring some peace to their lives. After all, they'd seen neighbors like Linda and George stand up for them, while Margaret had walked out in quiet defeat. The support they'd received had felt like a victory, a reminder that there were still good people willing to stand up against prejudice. For a few weeks, things did seem to improve. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance now waved as they passed by, and a few even stopped to chat, offering words of support and encouragement. But despite the change in atmosphere, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles weren't over. He knew Margaret well enough to know that she wouldn't take the meeting as a final defeat. Sure enough, her presence continued to loom over them like a dark cloud, quiet but watchful. Then, subtle acts of intimidation began again. The first sign was a small, seemingly harmless incident. One evening, Sharon found their welcome mat missing from the front door. At first, she thought the wind might have blown it away, but a search around the property turned up nothing. The mat wasn't valuable, but it was strange that it had disappeared without a trace. A few days later, they found a pile of dead leaves deliberately placed on their front step. Malcolm and Sharon brushed it off as a prank, but the feeling of being watched grew. Every so often, Sharon would look out the window to find Margaret standing on her porch, staring at their house with a stony expression, arms crossed. It was as if she was waiting, daring them to confront her. One night, as Malcolm was coming home from a late shift at the fire station, he noticed something unusual. A shadow lingered near the back fence of their yard, moving quickly as he approached. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding, straining to make out the figure in the darkness. But by the time he reached the fence, the shadow had vanished. When he told Sharon about it, she grew quiet, her brow furrowed in concern. "Do you think it's her, Margaret?" she asked, though her voice betrayed the answer she already feared. "I don't know," Malcolm replied, his tone dark. "But whoever it is, they're trying to scare us. And I'm not going to let them." The next day, Malcolm went to the local hardware store and bought a set of security cameras. He spent the weekend installing them around the property, determined to catch anyone who might be lurking near their home. Sharon felt a sense of relief once the cameras were in place, but the unease lingered. For a while, things seemed to settle down again. The cameras acted as a deterrent, and no further incidents occurred. The Bennetts tried to put the unsettling events behind them, focusing on work, school, and family. But then, one evening, as they were sitting down to dinner, they heard a loud bang outside, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Malcolm sprang up, heart racing, and ran to the front door. Sharon followed close behind, with the kids peering around the corner, their faces pale with fear. When Malcolm threw open the door, he found a large rock lying on their porch, surrounded by shattered glass from the front window. He looked up and saw Margaret standing on her porch, watching them with that familiar smirk on her face. Malcolm felt his blood boil. This had gone too far. Without a word, he stormed over to her house, his fists clenched at his sides. Margaret raised an eyebrow as he approached, her face twisted in a look of feigned innocence. "What do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "I want to know why you're targeting my family," Malcolm replied, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "First the graffiti, now this. Haven't you done enough?" Margaret's smirk widened. "I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe if you weren't so out of place, you wouldn't have to deal with these little inconveniences." Malcolm's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "We're not going anywhere, Margaret. This is our home now, whether you like it or not. And if you keep harassing us, I'll make sure you face the consequences." Her smirk faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, narrowing her eyes. "Do what you want. You can play the hero all you like, but you'll never fit in here. You don't belong." Malcolm turned away, his patience finally wearing thin. He knew that arguing with her would get him nowhere, but he was done playing her game. He returned to his house, where Sharon was sweeping up the broken glass, a look of worry etched across her face. "What did she say?" Sharon asked quietly. "Nothing worth hearing," Malcolm replied, pulling her into a reassuring embrace. "But I'm going to make sure this stops. I'm done letting her walk all over us." The following day, Malcolm took action. He filed a restraining order against Margaret, detailing the pattern of harassment and the incidents of vandalism. He spoke with his friends at the police precinct, asking for increased patrols near their home. And to further ensure their safety, he upgraded the security cameras, installing more around the perimeter of the property. For a few days, everything was quiet. Margaret kept her distance, and Malcolm felt a renewed sense of control over his life. But the peace was short-lived. One night, while reviewing footage from the security cameras, Malcolm noticed something odd. At around midnight, the cameras near the backyard fence picked up a flicker of movement. He watched intently as the figure of a person, a woman, approached the fence, reaching up as if trying to disable the camera. "Sharon, come look at this," he called, his heart pounding. She joined him, watching the screen with wide eyes. "Is that her?" Sharon whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. "It has to be," Malcolm replied, his jaw set. "She's trying to take out the cameras." The figure managed to twist the camera, cutting off the view, but not before Malcolm had captured a clear shot of her face. He immediately saved the footage and called the police, reporting the attempted vandalism. Officers arrived within minutes, reviewing the footage and acknowledging that there was enough evidence to press charges. The next morning, Margaret was served with a warning, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, as the officers informed her of the consequences if she continued her harassment. Malcolm watched from his porch, a sense of satisfaction mingling with exhaustion. This battle had gone on too long, but he felt that justice was finally being served. After the warning, Margaret's presence faded into the background. She stopped glaring at the Bennetts from her porch, stopped spreading rumors, and the incident ceased. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to interact with the Bennetts now came forward, expressing support and apologizing for their earlier aloofness. Linda, who had been supportive from the beginning, organized a neighborhood potluck, inviting the Bennetts and making it clear that they were now a cherished part of Oakwood Hills. At the potluck, Malcolm and Sharon were surrounded by warmth and laughter, their children playing happily with the other kids. It was a moment of relief, a reminder of why they had moved to Oakwood Hills in the first place. As the night wound down, Malcolm stood with Sharon, looking out over the gathering, a sense of peace settling over him. "We did it," Sharon murmured, squeezing his hand. "We made it through." Malcolm nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "We did, and we're not going anywhere." The Bennetts returned home that night, their spirits lifted. They knew that Margaret would still be lurking in the background, but her influence had waned, and they were no longer afraid. Oakwood Hills had finally become their home, not because they had been accepted, but because they had fought for their right to belong. As Malcolm closed the door behind them, he felt a deep sense of pride in his family's resilience. They had faced down prejudice, hate, and intimidation, emerging stronger and more united than ever. The shadows that had once haunted them had been dispelled, replaced by the warmth of a community that, at long last, welcomed them with open arms. And in that moment, Malcolm knew that Oakwood Hills was more than just a place. It was a promise they had made to each other, a testament to their strength, and a reminder that no matter the obstacles, they would always stand together as a family. A legacy of strength. Weeks had passed since the neighborhood potluck, and life in Oakwood Hills had finally settled into something that felt close to normal for the Bennetts. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted, and for the first time, Malcolm and Sharon felt the warm embrace of a genuine community. Their children, Emily and Jordan, were thriving, making friends, and enjoying their new home without the cloud of tension that had once hung over them. But while the open hostility had faded, Malcolm and Sharon were both aware that Margaret was still lurking in the background, resentful and silent. She had retreated into the shadows, her power stripped away after her warnings from the police and the loss of respect from her neighbors. Although her presence was less visible, Malcolm sensed that her resentment hadn't faded. One Friday evening, after a busy week, Malcolm returned home to the sound of laughter spilling from the backyard. He found Sharon seated at the picnic table, watching Emily and Jordan run through the sprinklers with the easy joy of childhood. The sight filled Malcolm's heart with a deep sense of contentment. They had come so far as a family, and he felt a surge of pride in the home they had created together, the life they had fought for. Malcolm took a seat beside Sharon, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched their children play. Sharon leaned into him, a warm smile on her face. "We did it, didn't we?" she whispered, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "We really made this place ours." Malcolm nodded, his gaze steady. "We did, and I'm proud of us for standing strong, even when it would have been easier to give up." Sharon's smile widened. "You know, Linda invited us to the neighborhood committee meeting next week. She said they're interested in bringing in some new voices, fresh ideas." Malcolm raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Us? On the committee? Apparently, people see us as a positive influence," Sharon said with a laugh. "Who would have thought?" Malcolm chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, maybe it's time for Oakwood Hills to see some changes." Sharon nodded, a look of determination crossing her face. "Exactly. If we can make even a small difference, maybe no one else will have to go through what we did. We can help this community grow." The idea of joining the neighborhood committee gave Malcolm a sense of purpose, a way to transform the trials they had faced into something meaningful. It was an opportunity to build a legacy, not just for their family, but for every family that came after them. And so, with a newfound resolve, Malcolm and Sharon decided to accept Linda's invitation, eager to play a role in shaping the future of Oakwood Hills. The following week, they attended the committee meeting, a gathering held in the neighborhood's small community center. Malcolm and Sharon felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as they entered, greeted by smiles and nods from neighbors who had once kept their distance. Linda waved them over, introducing them to the other members who welcomed them warmly. As the meeting began, Topics were discussed, from local events to plans for community improvements. Malcolm and Sharon participated thoughtfully, offering their perspectives and ideas. They spoke with honesty and optimism, sharing their hopes for a more inclusive, supportive neighborhood. By the end of the meeting, they were unanimously accepted as new members of the committee. But just as they were about to leave, a voice cut through the room. "So, you're really letting them join the committee?" Margaret stood near the doorway, her gaze icy as she looked around the room, her lips pressed into a thin line. Linda sighed, looking exasperated. "Yes, Margaret. Malcolm and Sharon are part of this community, just like anyone else. They've done more for Oakwood Hills than most." Margaret's face twisted in anger. "They don't belong here. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, and I know what's best for it. People like them will only bring trouble." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Margaret as she spewed her venomous words. But before anyone could respond, Malcolm stood up, his gaze unwavering as he met Margaret's glare. "Margaret, we're not here to cause trouble. We're here to make Oakwood Hills better, just like you say you want. But the difference between us is that we believe in lifting people up, not tearing them down. We believe in creating a place where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. If that's not what you want, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Margaret's face turned red, her fists clenched at her sides. But before she could retort, George, the neighbor who had initially been wary of the Bennetts, stood up. "Malcolm's right," he said firmly. "We've all seen how he and his family handled the hostility thrown their way. They've shown nothing but kindness, patience, and strength. I think it's time we support people who actually make a positive difference here." One by one, neighbors stood up, voicing their support for Malcolm and Sharon. Margaret looked around, realizing she was outnumbered, her influence shattered by the very community she had tried to turn against the Bennetts. With a look of disgust, she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. As the room settled back into quiet, Linda turned to Malcolm and Sharon, a warm smile on her face. "Thank you both for being here. You've already made this neighborhood a better place." In the weeks that followed, the Bennetts became an integral part of Oakwood Hills. They worked tirelessly with the committee to create new initiatives, organizing events that brought people together, and programs that fostered a more inclusive community spirit. They introduced monthly family nights, neighborhood cleanups, and even a mentorship program for the local youth. The children, too, began to feel the effects of the positive changes. Emily and Jordan no longer faced the cold shoulders and whispers that had once marked their days at school. They made close friends, children who welcomed them without reservation. The Bennetts had finally found a home, not just in their house, but in the hearts of the people around them. One bright Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood gathered in the Bennetts' backyard for a community barbecue, their second attempt at the joyful gathering they had once been denied. This time, it was a celebration of unity and resilience, with neighbors of all backgrounds coming together to share food, laughter, and stories. As Malcolm stood by the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with friends, he felt a profound sense of peace. Sharon was nearby, chatting with Linda and some other neighbors, while Emily and Jordan ran through the yard, their laughter filling the air. As he looked around, Malcolm thought about the journey that had brought them here, the obstacles, the challenges, the moments when they'd almost given up. But standing there, surrounded by the warmth and acceptance of their community, he knew that every struggle had been worth it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the guests began to leave, Sharon joined Malcolm by the grill, taking his hand in hers. They watched their children chase fireflies in the fading light, their silhouettes framed by the glow of the evening sky. "We did it," Sharon whispered, her voice filled with pride and gratitude. "We didn't just make a home here. We made a difference." Malcolm nodded, his heart full. "We did, and it's only the beginning." As the last of the guests departed and the evening settled into a quiet calm, Malcolm felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond anything he had ever known. They had transformed Oakwood Hills, not just for themselves, but for future families who would come seeking the same dream they had. The Bennetts had built more than a life in Oakwood Hills. They had built a legacy of strength, resilience, and love that would echo through the neighborhood for generations to come. And as they stood together in the twilight, hand in hand, they knew they were home, truly and completely, at last.